Progressive lawmakers in the House and the U.S. Senate announcing just on Thursday of this week, it was just yesterday, they now plan to introduce a new piece of legislation that would expand the size of the U.S. Supreme Court from 9 justices to 13 justices. Earlier today, I sat down one-on-one with one of those such Democrats, Representative Mondaire Jones of New York, to discuss the bill, the federal judiciary, and whether he thinks Justice Stephen Breyer should retire. It's a news-making interview. Check it out.
What happened in Georgia would not have been possible had Chief Justice John Roberts not gutted the heart of the Voting Rights Act in the year 2013 in a decision called Shelby v. Holder. Of course, just years before, in the year 2010, the Roberts Court decided Citizens United, which opened the floodgates to a torrent of dark corporate unlimited money in our elections. And as recently as 2 years ago, in the year 2019, a case called Rucho v. Common Cause, the court said, you know what, we're not going to weigh in on the issue of partisan gerrymandering of congressional districts, which allows QAnon conspiracy theorists to coast to victory in general elections after winning their primaries.
Okay, so you're tying all this to different voting rights legislation. Those states would argue, like in Georgia, they say elections are run at the state level. We have a right to do so. Should you consider lower court reform as well? And why target this specifically to the high court in the land?
Well, the two are very different. We absolutely must expand the lower courts. I know as a former clerk in the Southern District of New York that our district court judges are overworked and don't have the resources to adjudicate all of the cases that are coming before them. But the Judiciary Act of 2021 is about Supreme Court expansion so that we no longer have a 6-3 majority that is hostile to democracy itself, but rather one that is reflective of the will of the American people. Did you know that despite the fact that Democratic presidential candidates have won the popular vote in 7 of the last 8 presidential elections, Democratic presidents have only been able to appoint 4 of the last 19 Supreme Court justices? That is a distortion of our democracy. And of course, now we've got a rogue group of people who are not even allowing people to vote in this country. The Supreme Court has been an accomplice in these voter suppression efforts.
I know some of your progressive colleagues, like Congressman Ro Khanna of California, is very fond of that specific statistic to underscore a very similar point. I want to ask you about the Judicial Procedure Reform Bill of 1937, known to many other people through the lens of history as FDR's attempt to expand the court. Congressman Jones, it was Democrats, not even Republicans. It was members of his own party who said this cannot go. Why is right now the right time? And I understand your argument to say the court has not always been 9 people, but we have had high-profile moments in American history where this has been at least attempted or floated or proposed, and it has not gone anywhere. Why is now the time to change that?
Well, again, the size of the court has changed due to Congress on 7 different occasions in our nation's history. And I'm so glad you brought up the example of FDR, because I've been hearing and reading a number of ahistorical comments made by my Republican friends on the other side of the aisle about the alleged failure of FDR to get the Supreme Court to act in the best interests of the American people. FDR's court expansion proposal resulted in a rogue Supreme Court that had been striking down New Deal legislation, changing its tune, and immediately beginning to uphold that New Deal legislation, which today we just take for granted. And of course, we know that the Supreme Court is paying attention to what the American people and Congress in particular are proposing right now. And that is why we are moving forward to make sure that we can get accountability. I happen to believe that we will expand the court. It may not be today or tomorrow, but it will happen over time. And in the meantime, the Supreme Court should be paying notice to what Congress is doing to make sure that it is acting in the best interests of the American people.
I've covered Congress long enough to know that lawmakers in your position do not like to answer hypothetical questions, but would you be okay if Republicans in a future GOP presidential term essentially repurposed this legislation? Are you prepared to expand the court but have it be weaponized by the GOP along the same legal arguments that you are making?
They cannot make the same legal arguments that I am making because they are the ones who have indeed packed the court. We are trying to expand the court to unrig our democracy. Of course, it was the GOP that held that open seat on the Supreme Court during Obama's term for 14 months. Merrick Garland didn't even get a hearing to become the next Supreme Court justice. They invented a rule to do that, and then they rushed through the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett last fall, even as votes were being tabulated in connection with the presidential election of last year. And so the GOP is continuing to try to appoint and confirm justices of the Supreme Court who are hostile to democracy. So we're talking about apples and oranges here. And this is not a Republican versus Democrat thing, by the way. Justices John Paul Stevens and David Souter were Republicans, and they were appointed to the judiciary by Republican presidents, and they supported the fundamental right of all Americans to vote. That's a key distinction between the justices today.
Finally here, Congressman Jones, many people look back to the legacy of longtime Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as remarkable a life and legacy as it was. Many Democrats say perhaps Justice Ginsburg should have considered retiring while President Obama was still in term. Should Justice Breyer retire while Joe Biden is commander-in-chief?
There is no question that Justice Breyer, for whom I have great respect, should retire at the end of this term. I mean, my goodness, have we not learned our lesson? And so I'm really excited about the opportunity for this president, President Biden, to appoint and then for the Senate to confirm jurists on the Supreme Court who are not hostile to our democracy, who will adjudicate cases that will protect and preserve voting rights, and that will respect the will of Congress, frankly. I mean, it is really an activist 6-3 majority that we have that struck down the heart of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, a Voting Rights Act that had been reauthorized in 2006 unanimously in the Senate. Imagine that, and nearly unanimously in the House of Representatives. So there's something very different about today's Supreme Court, and now it's more conservative than it was in the year 2013 when Justice Roberts issued the opinion deciding that Shelby case.
All right, and with that final answer right there, Representative Mondaire Jones of New York becomes the first sitting lawmaker in Congress to publicly argue that Justice Stephen Breyer, who has been a Supreme Court justice since 1994, should officially retire. Very newsworthy bit of information there. Made a lot of headlines here in D.C., if I do say so myself.